Well, welcome everybody to this last session on the second day of the International Communal Studies Association Digital Conference in 2024. Um, this is going to be a fun session. Um, and I want to introduce myself. My name is Jan Martin Bang. I am speaking from Norway. I've been part of the organizing team in ICSA, um, and I've been involved with ICSA for quite a long time. In my other life, I'm a permaculture teacher and eco-village designer. This session, we're going to have a workshop on the psychology of communities. And I would like to ask Dan just to say a couple of words as Zoom tech, if you want to say anything.
Just let me know via the chat if you have any technical difficulties that you need help with. And please, if you haven't already done so, give a few words of introduction of yourself in the chat so we know who's here with us today.
Right. Thank you. Carl, you are a professional counselor of well-being, which is really great because I feel well already, and I can only how this is great. And you're also a professor, which is really great because that means we have two professors here, and I'm not one of them. So that you can wonder what that's about. You're going to run this session, and we're looking forward to that. And working with you is Francesca. And Francesca, you will introduce yourself after Carl has introduced himself. Is that okay? Right. Over to you, Carl.
Very good. Well, thank you for joining. My name is Carl, Dr. Carl Nassar. I'll tell you a little bit about myself to start, and then I'll invite Francesca to do the same. And then we'll lead right into our workshop together today. I've arrived here by a very long route. Growing up, my parents said I could be a doctor or an engineer. I problem solved better than I memorized. So engineer it was. I went to McGill University, a couple hours west of my parents' town, where I got my bachelor's degree in engineering. I got a little coin that told me I got the highest GPA in my graduating class when I graduated, and got a scholarship to do my master's degree, which I wrapped up also from McGill a year later, and then spent 4 more years there because I couldn't leave, finishing my doctorate degree in engineering as well. In the meantime, I'd met my wife, who said Montreal was far too cold and far too cloudy to possibly live, given she'd grown up in California. So I took a tenure track faculty position at Colorado State University as an engineer, taught engineering courses there, won Teacher of the Year, Researcher of the Year, built a $1 million research lab, published hundreds of conference and journal articles, and was on my way to academic success, earned tenure, and decided that really I liked the relationships far more than I liked the work. So it was time to leave. So I exited Stage Right, got new degrees in counseling psychology, ran a private practice for about 10 years, working with everything from couples to families to individuals to adults to adolescents. And then was tired of working by myself, thought I'd get a few colleagues to join me, began to grow group practice, which grew and grew and grew until I had 300 colleagues working alongside me. We had the largest outpatient mental health practice in the state of Colorado. I operated as president and CEO of that for a while, until that time felt done, stepped away, and for the last few years have been researching and writing about community and about this idea that in many ways we are born for a village, yet we arrive in a marketplace culture. And what happens to us psychologically when we have this mismatch between what we are wired for and what we arrive in? And how do we find our way back, which will be in many ways the theme of this talk. So a little bit about me, and I'm currently writing a book called Born for a Better World. And I met Francesca because, well, long time ago, but she is now serving as the editor of that book. And I'll let her tell you about her.
Hi, I'm Francesca. I live in rural France, but I work internationally as a writer, editor, and a communications consultant, mostly for nonprofits, but also for socially conscious clients. And unlike Carl, I was not raised by rigid people. I was raised by wolves and allowed to do whatever I wanted. So I've worn quite a few hats. I studied English originally. It's my first love, my first degree. And then I went back to school later to study landscape architecture. I was really happy to hear that I have a permaculturist in our midst, because my focus in landscape architecture was actually international resource management. And I was very interested in looking at like disaster mitigation from a community-centered design point of view. It's a bit of an unusual area, but I studied in Southeast Asia doing my thesis, and I began to observe, it was in post-tsunami areas, and I worked with a lot of NGOs, and I began to see how so many international organizations brought a very paternalistic, inefficient approach to disaster mitigation and response. And I was really quite disenfranchised by the whole experience. And I saw grassroots efforts in all of these communities really thriving and producing beautiful results. And I thought, I have no place here. I cannot contribute. So my own career took a left turn. I, instead of going into international resource management, started a farm and also taught permaculture and invited a lot of people in. It was a learning farm where I taught people how to come back and connect with the land and each other. And we did a lot of skill sharing. And through a very long road, I ended up in France, where I'm now trying to build a new community. But my work in life have generally focused on story and connection. And I'm fascinated and focused on the thread of storytelling and how it really ties us together as humans. So that's me, and I'm going to begin our slideshow now.
Just while you
Thank you.
set up, can I just ask everybody to, everybody has their cameras on, and mute your sound system so that we don't get any disturbing noises. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I appreciate that. All right. So the title of our talk, Inside Out, the Psychology of Intentional Communities. Francesca, if you go to the next slide, that would be wonderful. Okay. So we live in this marketplace culture, and this culture really roars at us. It shares a single message over and over and over again. It's a narrative the culture spends $1 trillion a year echoing over and over again. And what is it that our culture is telling us? Well, from a psychological perspective, the culture is sharing a very interesting message, a rather agonizing one. It says that we don't have an innate value. We don't have an innate worth as humans. However, says the culture, we can earn our value and we can earn our worth on economic terms. That we can earn our value by earning for ourselves and by spending on ourselves. That the questions that matter most of all are questions like these. What do you do for a living? How much do you make? What's your net worth as measured in dollars? And this message plays out so many times that most of us get caught up in making it. We get caught up in earning a living by ourselves, or if we're lucky, with the help of one spouse or partner. We get caught up on going shopping by ourselves, or later in life with a young child in our front seat of our shopping carts. We get busy working by ourselves, occasionally getting together in meeting rooms or boardrooms with some of our colleagues. And what happens now is that it is an exhausting thing to have to live an individual work life, an individual home life, an individual everything life. No wonder we're tired. No wonder we're overwhelmed. And it's not only exhausting, it's very isolating to live in this way. And so we find ourselves feeling somewhat isolated, exhausted, alone. And then one night it dawns on us. We're laying in bed, the world goes quiet, and this unsettling feeling is there inside of us. And eventually it rises up and we find words for it. And we realize at some level, this isn't the world we were born for. We were born for a better world. You can switch the slide for us, Francesca. Thank you. Now, this is an idea that has been in many ways spoken in different language from many different fields. The field of psychology, for a very long time, for well over 100 years, has been telling us we are literally born for each other. That from the time we exit our parents' wombs, in fact, even before that, even in the womb, we are relationship-seeking beings. Of all the things that motivate us in this world, nothing motivates us more than our longing for each other. Francesca, you're going to jump in here and say a few things.
So it's very difficult to demonstrate tangibly how our brains are hardwired for connection, but we have another way of irrefutably proving and demonstrating this, how deep our need for connection and relationship is. And I think it's conventional knowledge now. We have known historically how poorly children do in orphanages. We know this is not an optimal environment for children, but it wasn't until 1915 that researchers actively began to acknowledge and consider this. And there was a Johns Hopkins researcher in 1915 who did a survey of all the orphanages in Baltimore. And his survey revealed, and I just want to say, like, brace yourself, like 90% of the infants in these orphanages died within a year of being admitted. I find that number shocking. And so now the research began, and over several decades, it was observed over and over, sort of the similar things. One of the best examples was in the 1940s, post-World War II, in 2 different orphanages in British-occupied Germany. One orphanage was run by a very cheerful, sort of loving woman. The other was run by a very taciturn, stern woman who believed in strictness and punishment. And observing over 6 months these children in these orphanages, the strict orphanage had children who were failing to thrive. They were underweight, they were undersized, they were developmentally stunted. And in the other orphanage, they were doing extremely well. They were, normal children who were growing and normal weight. Fast forward a little bit longer, more research. And this also happens in cases of extreme neglect within the family, not only in orphanages. They finally found a name for this condition that could render a 4-year-old child the size of a 2-year-old child with actual bone structure, growth delayed. They call it psychosocial dwarfism, also known as deprivation dwarfism. And what is, for me, the most remarkable part of this tragic condition is that if a child suffering from this deprivation dwarfism is placed into a loving home during any of their developmental, early childhood stages, this condition is reversed. They put on weight, they grow normally, they develop at a healthy rate, and they achieve normal cognitive and motor development. So we know with a shadow of a doubt that being held, touched, being in a relationship with our parents or caretakers, it actually triggers and stimulates the release of the hormones that are necessary for growth and development. So our need for one another is not just in our heads, it's written in our bodies.
Thank you, Francesca. Yeah, I got you. Yeah. And this speaks to something really important that psychologists also tell us about relationship. And that is that if you're really looking to find a sense of value and worth, you're never going to find it in economic terms. The place you're going to find it is in the warm embrace of another person. It is very much in seeing ourselves reflected back in the loving eyes of the people around us that we genuinely feel our sense of value and our worth. When that happens, we don't anxiously worry about having to prove our worth and show that we deserve a seat at the table. we then innately feel that we belong in the circle of life, and not just that we do, but that everyone does. The neuroscientists agree with what psychologists have been telling us. They say, look, our brains, the very shape of our brains, the neural networks they contain, they light up when we are in contact with each other. That our brains are very much designed in such a way that we are hardwired for each other. And anthropologists don't want to be left out of this conversation. They jump in as well. And they say, look, they say over humanity's 200,000-year history on this planet, for almost all of our time here, our need for relationship was beautifully, eloquently met by our lives in the village. When we were born into a village, 40 pairs of eyes greeted us, 40 pairs of hands held us. And they didn't just do that when we were born. This continued throughout our life, throughout our childhood, throughout the turbulent waters of adolescence. As in adulthood, when there were the mighty wonderful things entered into our lives, they were celebrated by all these people with us. And when the necessary losses and griefs and sorrows tumbled into our lives, there the village was to hold us, to carry us. This village was very much a secure base from which we could go out and experience the world. And also a safe haven that we could always, also a safe haven that we could always return back into. We could always come home to and always feel welcomed and warmly received. We were very much born for a village. Now, if you still doubt that, and I doubt any of you do, but just in case you harbor any lingering doubts, all we have to do is take a look at colonial history. Because what we have in colonial history is something very interesting. We have people that lived in the European marketplace culture, in the Native American indigenous cultures, and were then given a choice as to where they wanted to live. We have many, many examples of Europeans arriving into North America and being adopted into or abducted into American Indian tribes, and many instances of Native American peoples who married into or were abducted into European cultures, who were later given a choice as to where did they want to live. And almost to a person, they chose time and again to live in these Native American cultures. And we know why they chose that, because we have their writings that tell us. And thematically, their writings tell us over and over again the same three things. First, I don't want to have to work so hard just to make a living, just to be alive. Second, there is a sense of belonging and place and home that I simply can't find in a European marketplace culture. And third, I love living in a place where no one lives in poverty, not because I myself am afraid of being poor, but because there's such a relief not having to watch so many people around me live with the humiliation of poverty, live with the suffering of poverty. So we know, we have all this data that says we are born for a village. But if this is true, you say, okay, maybe you've convinced me, maybe we're born for a village. But if this is the case, how in the world has it ended up that we are all living here in a marketplace culture? So to answer that question, we need to go back about 20,000 years. We need to go back to prehistoric Europe. And of course, by prehistoric, I simply mean this is before there was written history. But even in the absence of written history, we now have enough archaeological evidence, enough anthropological research to very much understand the broader themes of what was happening back then. Now, first thing we can do is clear up a couple of misconceptions about what life was not like back then. Because there are two main misconceptions that permeate in our culture. One came from Thomas Hobbes' writing in 1651 when he wrote the book Leviathan. And in this book, he says, humans are by and large solitary, selfish creatures. Well, we know that's not true. The psychological literature is very clear on that. I know I'm not. I know you're not. I know my family's not. I'm sure your family's not. But Hobbes somehow didn't know all of this. So he starts with this premise. And from there, he goes on to say, well, then life 20,000 years ago must have been brutal. It must have been a time of kill or be killed. And if Francesca was alive during this time, then she would really have, in order to survive, had to find a band of people, but not a very friendly band of people. This would be a band of people that was ruled by an dominant alpha male ruler. And Francesca would have had to surrender her life, live a life of submission in trade for her survival in this tribe. And Hobbes says the only thing that saves us all is these repressive government systems that show up about 5,000 years ago and save us all from our darker nature. Prior to that time, life probably really wasn't worth living. We know none of that is true. Rousseau steps in 100 years later and tells us almost the exact opposite. He says Francesca's life 20,000 years ago, it's an idyllic life. It's terrific. It's almost utopian. She's living this egalitarian hunter-gatherer tribe, and life is fantastic. And really, it's only about 10,000 years ago that things start to go haywire. When agriculture shows up, it makes bigger cities possible. And these cities require big bureaucracies. And these bureaucracies require armies, and they require police forces and legal systems and tax collectors to make us pay for it all. But it turns out none of that's true either. So what did the anthropologists and archaeologists discover about life in this time? Well, had you and I traveled back to that time, we would have found ourselves at the beginning of the end of the last great ice age. The snow caps of Europe would have been beginning to recede, and a great melting would have been underway. And what we would have seen is a collection of villages. Now, they would have been in diverse places in different geographies. One might sit in the tall grass near a river. One might sit in the evergreens of a boreal forest. One might be carved out of, one might be caves carved out of sandstone cliffsides. And what we see in this is that if Francesca were there at that time, she could have packed her belongings, which would have roughly fit in a backpack, left her village, and she would have found herself welcomed and warmly received wherever she went. And as she arrives in another village, she's not only welcomed, her ideas are welcome. And what you have is essentially people having a kaleidoscopic understanding of the world, a kaleidoscopic understanding of the cosmos, enriched by all these different ideas from all these different village cultures that come together. This is come and gone over and over again in human history. And Francesca is the recipient of a long history of living in this time. It's likely it went on for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years prior to her arrival. It's a time without war. We can find no evidence of war at all, no slavery, and no outsider, as people are welcomed wherever they go. So what happens? How do we go from this time of great hospitality to where we are today? Francesca, if you switch slide, oh, you did already, wonderful. So this is a time and a space where we have great social experimentation going on. We know this with certainty. Some of these villages change their social structure as often as every season. Others once a year, some less often than that. And part of the reason you can have this great social experimentation is you have this freedom of movement. No one's locked in place. So you can play with the social systems, you build a better one, life's better for everybody. If it goes haywire, you can just get up and leave. Or if enough people want to get up and leave, you can just ignore the leader and they have essentially no power. Now, anthropologists aren't exactly sure why this happened, but they know this did happen. That during the time of great hospitality, while there were many different social structures in play, they all shared a fundamental theme, a felt sense that we were one people, that there was a level of human kindness that permeated, that there was far more than connected us than could ever separate us. And yet somehow a number of these social experiments seem to go awry at one time, where some of these villages begin to define themselves not as a part of the greater social world, but start defining themselves apart from the greater social world. They start to augment their differences between themselves and the people outside of them. And what starts to happen is you start to have a diminishment in this kaleidoscopic understanding of the world, and it starts to give way into a flatter, more dualistic way of looking at the world. Good, bad, black, white, and perhaps worst of all, us, other. And all of a sudden you start to have a differentiation between one set of peoples and another. This is what anthropologists call the breakdown of this time of great hospitality into what they call cultural areas. You can go ahead and switch the slide here. And so what happens now is you start to have this building of these ideological walls that separate people in certain villages from the outsiders. They slowly start to stop welcoming the outsiders. And once they start to stop welcoming the outsiders, then it becomes very easy to start to feel progressively more paranoid about them. And you have this movement from ideological walls to literal walls. Because after all, the outsiders, they must be the beggars and the blind men who are going to take up all our resources. It may be the orphans and the widows who will take without giving back. It's the band of travelers that are going to show up and just take from us what's ours. Best to build these walls to protect us. There's a very particular dilemma that happens when you build a wall. It's not only that you lock people out, almost more dangerous than that is you lock a population in place. And once you lock a population in place, and they no longer feel they have the freedom to move because the others outside there are dangerous, now that allows for leaders in that place to begin to arbitrarily abuse their power. And it's quite possible in some of these villages that some of these leaders began to arbitrarily apply their power to have a greater sense of rule over others. If you switch to the next slide for me, Francesca. Now, what happens here is that once people are locked in place, it is quite possible, let me say it this way. War is not a natural state of being. It is very difficult to convince someone to go to war. It takes years of psychological manipulation and emotional manipulation to convince people to go to war. But if you have a population locked in place inside a wall with nowhere to go, it is possible for a leader to start to convince its citizenry that what you need to do to survive is you need to proactively protect yourself against the others out there. The moment that first slingshot is fired, the moment that first arrow flies from that bow, the moment that first spear is thrown, the moment that you start to have these cultures of separation begin to attack these cultures of connection that are part of this greater network of hospitality, you have the beginning of the end of what unfolds over 20,000 years, where slowly, gradually, what you see are the villages of the world gradually overrun by what becomes a single culture, what becomes a monoculture, the culture that evolves in today's consumer culture. And what's fascinating about this culture of today is that it is the natural extension of those walls that were built. Those walls that separated us from other, they shrink and they shrink and they shrink and they shrink over time until the only thing left inside that wall is me. And as the walls shrink and all that's left inside that wall is me, then what is outside the wall is everyone else, including you. And so us and other becomes me and you. So no wonder we end up in a culture that says, I have to survive on my own. No wonder we end up in a culture that says I have to go earn a living by myself and buy things for myself. Francesca, you're going to jump in here and say a few things.
Yeah. If we were to consider what a culture looks like that is not heavily influenced by outside cultures, you would be hard-pressed to find a better example than Easter Island, colloquially known as Rapa Nui. It is the most remote inhabited island on Earth, and most of us know it because of these mysterious carved figures known as moai. We also, those of us who are into sustainability may have read Jared Diamond's Collapse. Maybe we know Easter Island because of its cautionary tale. So the story goes, these Rapa Nui people created an ecocide by harvesting all of their trees in order to transport these moai to their various outposts throughout the island. And of course, further investigation has shown us that this story is most likely a fabrication. It's what you get when Western academics view an ancient culture through a lens of modern Western culture, one of consumption and, sort of superiority, like, oh, these silly villagers and their folly. So instead of looking through that lens, I would like to sort of reframe Easter Island, Rapa Nui, and first consider what type of community these people enjoyed. And the first feature is, of course, these beautiful moai themselves. These are stone sculptures that took apparently 12 men an entire year to produce just one. And after they produced one, it would probably take weeks for them to move from the quarry to its final destination. It would take a team, maybe 30 men, certainly dozens of men. They were moving them sometimes 20 kilometers or more, which is an incredible feat unto itself. So what kind of society has the ability to prioritize? Oh, there are over 1,000, almost 1,000 of these sculptures. So this is a huge endeavor that took several hundred years to accomplish. So we consider, what kind of culture has the capacity for this? Well, for one, they're certainly not capitalist. They're certainly not living in a marketplace. They have the leisure and the capacity socially, the social cohesion necessary to prioritize the creation of monumental art, and then to coordinate the transportation and erection of this art. How else, what other features does this tell us? Like, these were not hungry people who are struggling to feed themselves and provide for themselves. They are not focused on creating monumental art as a cultural priority. So we do know from the archaeological record that there were many, many, many tools, all agricultural, and no weapons. So we don't know precisely what the population was. Some say close to 30,000, some say it never got to be more than 10,000, but we do know that the Rapa Nui people lived in great abundance and in peace for more than 1,400 years of isolation, until the first European explorers discovered them in 1722. A Dutch sailing ship arrived there. And we know this because they have really extensive logbooks with really, really precise records. And these Dutch sailors, when they arrived, they found an island teeming with life, very abundant agricultural systems, but more importantly, they found islanders who were curious and welcoming, who gathered on the shore, brought no weapons, welcomed them. And they may have been a bit like overly solicitous, because at some point, sort of nervous sailor ended up opening fire. They killed 9 of the islanders. And even yet, they were able to make peace. These visitors stayed for several days. They were given, food and supplies to continue their journey. And they were very impressed with like the vigor and health and generosity of these people. Well, fast forward about 50 years later, and the celebrated Captain James Cook landed there in 1774, and he found a slightly different situation. He found islanders who were considerably more suspicious. They came bearing some arms. They still had abundance. They still welcomed them cautiously, but he found a population that seemed much lower. And from there on, the island was sort of marked as a fantastic place for sailors to come and re-up if they needed supplies and food. Unfortunately, being of that era, some visitors found it a convenient place to get some slaves if they were understaffed. But we can sort of look at this progression and say, what happened between the first visit and the second? Well, we know that Europeans generally brought disease to uncontacted peoples, and we can be certain that that happened here. Well, suddenly you have an island that has been rather prosperous, rather healthy. Now you have disease. Obviously, you're going to have internal struggle and a loss of that social cohesion, because we don't know exactly who they prayed to and how, but we do know that suddenly disease has come to the island, and they must have felt that they were doing something wrong, that their gods were no longer favoring them. Their relative peace was certainly shattered by the onset of disease. Of course, later visitors brought enslavement, eventually colonization, and ultimately it brought an end to the freedom and self-sufficiency of this island. We do know that they did not deforest themselves into an ecocide. Instead, the rats that they brought originally to the island as a food source probably depleted all of the seeds of the palm trees and eventually caused them to die out, just as an aside. But my question is, well, what would have happened if these visitors from afar would have perceived the Rapa Nui not only as a source of supplies, slaves, an island to be conquered? What if they had recognized the social cohesion, the culture? This is the only Polynesian island historically that had any type of writing. And unfortunately, the last of the priests and the sort of leaders of this island were shipped off as slaves, and we have no idea how to translate this writing. We lost something very great there. What could have happened if we had discovered and valued this culture and tried to uncover some of its mysteries from its people? Instead, we have lost a profound part of human history, and things could have been different. It didn't have to be this way.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's part of what I want to share here. These sort of tragic stories, historically tragic stories, speaking to how much has been lost, are also double as stories of hope. Things are not what Hobbes said they were. We're not stuck with the best we can do being oppressive systems of government to keep down our darker natures. We're not stuck, as Rousseau had suggested, with only minor tweaks to large government systems that are necessary given our population size. What these stories tell us is that over and over again, humanity has found its way into these times of great hospitality. They have come and gone and come again. And perhaps the winds of history blown a little bit differently, and the world hadn't split up 20,000 years ago into these cultural areas, perhaps we wouldn't have had so many of what we have today. The enslavement of many Black tribes in Africa, the decimation of American Indian populations, concentration camps, prison camps, Hiroshima. This may have been a very different world. But what we do know is that we as humans are very well designed for cultural change. And that if we have perhaps a great work in front of us, it is the work of bringing ourselves back little by little to a time of great hospitality. Now, I want to talk about how we get there and how we find our way back. And the way we find our way back begins within us, as well as around us. But in order to speak to the changes that we're going to have to make inside of us, I want to talk for a moment about what happens to us when we arrive in a marketplace culture, knowing that we were born for a village. So first, we are recipients of a very diminished inheritance. Instead of having 40 pairs of eyes greet us, instead of having 40 pairs of hands hold us, we only have 1 or 2 pairs of eyes that greet us. And these are the tired, exhausted, lonely eyes of our parents, who themselves have had to grow up in a marketplace culture. They themselves have unresolved traumas when no one was there to hold them in their childhoods, unresolved sorrows when no one was there to comfort them, when the losses tumbled into their lives. This is who greets us upon our arrival into this world. What a diminishment from the 40 pairs of eyes, the 40 pairs of hands that might have been there long ago. Now, there's no way these 1 or 2 people could possibly meet all of our emotional needs. There's no way these 1 or 2 people could ever meet all of our relational needs. So what happens to us? Well, perhaps our parents have their own traumas around sadness. And when we begin to cry, our parents turn to us and say, "Stop your crying or I'll really give you something to cry about." Or maybe they have unfinished business around their anger. And when we get angry, they shout us down and silence us when we're angry. And we start to realize as children that we are faced with a terrible, awful choice. We can hold on to all of who we are. We can hold on to our anger and our sadness, even in the face of our parents rejecting us. But then we feel like we risk becoming castaway children. We risk being thrown away. We don't dare take that risk. We feel we have to make the other choice. Remember that outer wall? We feel like we have to build a wall now inside of ourselves. And on the outside of that wall, we push out the parts of ourselves that we feel won't allow us to be loved. We push away the anger. We push away the sadness. Perhaps we push away our sexuality. We push away whatever part of ourselves we feel was unwelcomed by our parents. And what we leave inside that wall is just the parts of us we think will allow us to be good boys and good girls and earn our parents' love. And now we put ourselves in a very difficult spot because we were never meant to live our lives with only parts of ourselves available to us. The parts outside the wall long to get back in. Our sadness, our anger, our sexuality longs to return to us so that we can feel and experience all of who we are. And inside the wall are these parts we're left with. They're not built to manage our lives all by ourselves, but a challenging task we've now given ourselves. Now, the saddest part about this splitting of ourselves into parts is that it doesn't work. We end up unable to earn our parents' love because we were never the problem in the first place. Right? And the bind for us is that rather than feeling valued for all of who we are, we feel that parts of who we are shameful, parts of who we are unwanted, parts of who we are unwelcome. And so here we are in the culture, and we find ourselves in this spot where we are unable to feel our sense of value, to feel our sense of worth. Because even when we break ourselves apart, we still find that we are not receiving the love that we long for. And this is where the culture steps in. So you can skip a couple slides ahead here. And one more. And you can take over from here.
So we're wondering, how did we get here? How do we go from a relationally rich place to where we are now? And a lot of it has to do with games. Primarily, like everybody's familiar with games, right? We compete for points, and whoever gets the most points wins. And the trick to a game is that a game designer has strategically made it so that it's challenging enough to keep you interested and easy enough to actually be winnable. And you may have noticed that we are living in a world where so many of parts of our day-to-day life are gamified, both formally and informally. And it starts off literally from birth. And I challenge you to think, especially if you're American, how many times you have heard or been a proud parent talking about the percentile of growth of a baby. People are literally beginning with, oh, my kid's in the 99th percentile. Like, you're so proud, as if you're scoring points with your baby's body before they're even out of diapers. And it kind of escalates from there, sort of from our first steps to our first words. We're sort of on this continuum of milestones by which we are measured. We're measuring our sort of worth and value by our progress relative to each other. And by the time we're old enough to play sports and earn grades, our brains our very plastic and elastic childhood brains have already adapted so that we light up when we win points. Our brain is stimulated by this idea of winning points. And it's not because we're having fun, but it's because we win rewards, which are mostly relational. Like, if you think about when you get an A on a test and your teacher smiles at you and you take that A home and your parents say, oh, good job. And you score a goal on the soccer field and your teammates cheer, your coach gives you a high five. It's all of these things really feed our idea that we have to earn points in order to win the approval, admiration, and even the envy that we desire. And regardless of whatever reason we started playing and enjoyed it, somewhere along the way, we sort of lose ourselves to this thing. It's no longer about pleasure, but it's a strategy for proving our worth. And instead of tapping into the deep connection and relationship that actually is supposed to soothe and comfort us and bring us together, we get lost in this idea that earning points, however those points play out in our world, that's how we deserve the love and acceptance that we long for. And if we earn enough points, we can just relax and just feel worthy for a moment. But do we ever actually feel worthy? You know, as we grow up into this consumer culture, this process, it continues, this cycle of performance for points. Think about if you do well enough at school, you can get accepted into a high-ranking college, then you can graduate with a high-value degree. And if you're really lucky, you can get a high-paying job. But wait, there's more. You get the job and it's not over. It's like suddenly all of your efforts are again measured by various systems, you know, key performance indicators. A KPI is just another way of measuring whether you're in law or medicine, sales, marketing. There's always a system that will demonstrate whether or not you're succeeding and how much you are winning. And we believe that we're winning just by racking up these points. And it doesn't matter how many sacrifices we've made, how many relationships, how much attention, the price we pay for that becomes irrelevant. It's just proving our worth. And all of this has happened so early in life that our brain chemistry has shifted. We're hardwired for performance. Here, this is your brain on winning points. Like we're all hooked on this kind of addiction of performing. But the question is, does it give us the relationships that we want? And of course it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. Well, we have this marketplace culture that says like, oh, whoever has the most toys wins. The truth is that toys are not relationships, and we are not more relationally wealthy as we climb up this ladder. In fact, recent studies have shown us pretty unequivocally that the more money we earn, the fewer people we interact with. And in some ways, it gets us closer and closer to becoming sociopaths. This is very easy to visualize. Low-income people tend to live in multifamily buildings, sometimes even in multi-generational households. They use public transportation. They do laundry in like public laundromats. You are living in a very high relational world because you are in contact with people really all the time. But then let's see, you make a little more money. What's the first thing you do? You get a car because it's more convenient. So now you're not on the bus anymore. Then a little more money, you move into a standalone house. You don't have to share walls anymore. You make more money. Maybe you get to move into a gated community. It just keeps the riffraff out, safer for the kids. Even more money, you get to live in a mansion. You have a gated mansion. So now you don't even have to look at your neighbors. Nobody can come in. You're safe. You know, imagine it escalates. Then you're flying just on a private jet because, who wants to deal with all those people? And then you have an assistant who buys your groceries. And at this point, you are so relationally impoverished that you no longer see yourself as part of the community. And the only people you relate to are those very few people whom you perceive as just like you. So this is the prize. You play stupid games, win stupid prizes. And the really sad part about this is that even though we are encouraged to get more and bigger and faster and better, there's no real relationship between relational, emotional wealth and high earnings. We know that there's a threshold for earning where people have peak happiness, and it's fairly moderate. I think in America, it's around 100,000 for household earning. And after that, happiness levels begin to deteriorate. So you can win the game, but still end up relationally poor. So how do we get here from seeking loving relationships to believing that points and things will give us the love and acceptance that we truly seek? And one of the main ways we get here is through advertising. And since we're talking a lot about childhood development, it's really important to recognize that America, we're focused on America, of course, but in America, advertising is massively focused on children. In the early 80s, the Federal Trade Commission, thanks to Congress, it lost its ability to regulate how children are advertised to. And since then, children's consumer spending as a segment has increased by 1/3 every single year. It went from, I think, 4 billion in 1984 to 40 billion in 2008. It's just been up and up and up every year. And we now calculate that most children spend their childhoods exposed to around 40,000 ads a year. What does that do to you? What does it do to a child who already feels less than and disconnected, and as if they're sort of in this battle to win points in order to prove their worth and be loved and accepted? Well, an interesting thing about advertisers is that they've figured out this thing they call nagging. They want children to be exposed repeatedly to the same ad because they want them to nag their parents. They figured that there's a magic number. It's the number 9. After, like, you can beg your parents for 5 times. 5 times your parents are like, oh yeah, whatever. The 7th time they're like, gosh, they really want this thing. And by number 9, your parents are thinking, you know what, sweetie, next time we go to the store, we'll pick that up for you. It's like, and how can you resist? Children are very convincing. But the psychology behind this industry is really something. It's predatory, and it preys on both parents and children. It preys on children who are convinced that they need things that demonstrate how much their parents love them and how valuable they are. And it preys on parents who feel guilty because they're not spending enough time with their kids, because their attention is fragmented. So they know that if they buy their kid that thing, it will show them how much they really love them. And I want Carl to talk a little bit more about the psychology behind this industry and how it works its magic on us.
Yeah, one of the things that's very interesting about advertising is we tend to think it has no real effect on us. But children can't differentiate between a parent, a teacher, and an advertiser. To them, each one of those is an equally powerful authority figure. So when an advertiser tells them something, they believe it at a young age the same way they would a parent or a teacher. And what do these advertisers tell kids? Well, advertisers have figured out that what I shared earlier, which is that children are struggling to feel an innate sense of value and worth. They're struggling to have the relationships they long for. Now, advertisers know that what they are advertising to kids won't ever give them the relationships that they need. But these advertisers choose to actively lie to children. And what they say is, look, if you have this ball, your dad will go out and play with you. Look, if you just have this book, your mom will read bedtime stories to you. Look, if you just have this game, then what will happen will be your friends will want to come over and they'll want to play with you. And that this is not just stuff, this is magical stuff. This stuff has the magic power to bring relationships back into your life. And children believe this message, and they get hooked on this idea that stuff will bring them home to the relationships that they long for. By the time we get old enough to realize that that may not be true, our brains have already gotten hooked on this idea of consumption. Even in adulthood, we believe we buy the new barbecue kit and it will bring our family back together. We take our kids out for a happy meal and it will make them happy. We get the new pair of jeans and we will feel confident again, confident enough that people will like us again. We tend to believe that that stuff can be the doorway back to relationship. But we know that's not true. We have the data that says that the more connected you are to your stuff, the less happy you are. Because what all the consumption does is it doesn't bring you back to each other. What it does is it brings you back to stuff. And it's not just production. You can earn your way into your worth, but that only gets you to have more money, but not more relationship. It's not only consumption. You can consume your way into your worth, but that only gets you hooked on stuff. It's everything else. Our culture says, look at this phone. This is not a phone. This is a gateway to relationship. If you take this phone, I can right now call family. I could right now text friends. If they're not available, don't worry. There's a whole world of social media out there I can interact with right away to make new friends. On top of that, I can get on a game right now and play with 100 or 1,000 other people at one time. Surely this is a gateway to relationship. But the more we use our phone, the more it bings at us on average 150 times a day. The more we get hooked the more we get hooked on the device, not on each other. The culture does this with so many things. It says take alcohol. Why, if you really want to have a good time, if you really want to celebrate, you celebrate with a glass of champagne in your hand. If you really want to go out and have a good evening, you go to the sports bar with your buddies with a beer in your hand. That alcohol will be the gateway to the relationship you're longing for. But that too doesn't work. Again and again and again, our culture hooks us on all these different things, promising us that they will be the doorway to the relationships that we long for, and just being valued in the relationships the way we seek to be. But all it does time and again is it hooks us on the wrong thing. Go ahead to the next slide, Francesca. Now, when you wonder what is the net effect of all this? Well, listen, there is a US Department of Labor study. They do an annual time use study. And what they find is really quite fascinating. I think quite hard for most people to believe. What they find is the average American with kids at home spends 8 hours a day working, 8 hours a day sleeping. And of the remaining 8 hours a day, 4 of them are spent on leisure time. And by leisure time, essentially, we mean getting lost to our phones, getting lost to the different things the culture has pulled us into. But if you'd ask the average American, do you have 4 hours of leisure time in a day? They would say, absolutely not. I am so busy with all the important tasks of taking care of kids and family and work. I have no time for myself. So how is this possible? Francesca, you could switch slides for a minute. It's possible through what we call the doorway effect. The doorway effect is a very simple concept. If Francesca's sitting in her living room and she's working on responding to emails, and suddenly she finds herself hungry, and she gets up and walks to the kitchen. The moment she crosses that doorway between the living room and the kitchen, she tends to forget what she was doing in the living room. Our brains tend to be context oriented. And when she's in the kitchen, now she's caught up in, oh, I should get a drink of water. Oh, I should do something else. Now, the way this plays out in our current culture is this. Francesca's at work. She's responding to emails at work. And a bing comes in on her phone. And she decides she doesn't really want to look, but she says she'll take a quick peek to see who it is. Turns out it's her spouse. Her spouse wanting to stop at the hardware store on the way back from work to pick something up. She decides she's just going to go online for just a moment just to see if the store has it in stock. And they do. But while she's online, she thinks, oh, I should probably follow up on that news story I saw earlier this morning. She goes over to NewYorkTimes.com and reads that story. And as she does, and scrolls a little bit further down, she sees that her favorite soccer player has been injured, she didn't know about. She goes over to her team's website to look at what's happening with that player. And as she's looking on that website, she sees that the new player signed a new contract, a lucrative new contract, which makes her wonder about how her financial well-being is going. So she goes over to her Fidelity.com site to check her investments. And here she goes off, and there's 20, 30 minutes spent from the addiction to news, the addiction to sports, the addiction to money. And there goes the time of her life. And this is what happens in our culture. It hooks us into all these false promises of all these false ways that we're going to get back to relationship. And all they ever do is just eat up the time of our lives. All right, we can go to the next slide. So you're going to speak to this one.
So perhaps the most isolating and challenging part of these lives that we're living, these lives of point seeking and distraction and escapism, is that part of the game that we've bought into is concealing how much we are suffering for it. And I want you to think about the language that is commonly associated with achievement. It's like, never let them see you sweat, or fake it till you make it, or something I think we all grew up with, which was like, no pain, no gain. All these things, what they all have in common is concealing our struggle. And meanwhile, we're all trying to do these things alone that we community. So yet, of course, we are lonely, and of course we are exhausted. And worst of all, we're convinced that revealing these things to each other will be perceived as weakness. And God forbid we lose some of those points that we've worked so hard to gain. And so instead of acknowledging our collective and individual grief, or even validating our own pain, we minimize it by telling ourselves, our friends, our families, how lucky we are. You know, at least we're not that guy over there. At least we're not homeless. At least we're not starving. At least we're not living under threat of war. And this is, in my opinion, a profound tragedy that takes us not only further from one another, but further from our humanity. We are commodifying the suffering of others to use as a proof point for how great our lives are by comparison. And this degrades our humanity, and it removes our ability to empathize with both ourselves and one another. So the question is, of course, how, in this whole big picture, how do we come back to one another? Like children that have been stunted by neglect, like how do we grow into the whole and healthy selves that we were intended for? I will let Carl answer some of those questions.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, this is now the question, right? Born for a village, arriving in a marketplace, seeing what happens inside of us as we arrive here. How do we find our way back home? You go to switch slides, Francesca, when you get a chance. Thank you. The key in all this is a willingness to slow down. It comes from a willingness to interrupt our lives. I grew up very much being taught that interruptions were very bad, that one should never interrupt someone else. And really, by and large, when I'm busy working, no one should really interrupt me. That interruptions are unwelcome. But it turns out interruptions are the doorway to transformation. Because what we really need is we need to be willing to interrupt our lives, to slow down and interrupt what we're about to do next in many key moments of our lives. We want to do that each time we find ourselves leaning out of a relationship instead of leaning into it, to slow down, to catch our breath, to invite all of who we are back in, to invite the relational parts of ourselves back in, and then to choose what do we want to do in the relationship now. We find ourselves inclined to attack in relationship instead of approach, to slow down, to catch our breath, to within us to allow all of what we're feeling to be there. And then to make a choice as to what do we want to do with the relationship around us. That when we find ourselves inclined to rush and pick up our phone and check our email or a text message or whatever it might be, to slow down before we pick it up, to catch our breath, to invite all of us back in, and to make a choice as to what we want to do next. Each time we find ourselves caught up in our anxiety, before we act out of our anxiety, because anxiety has a tendency to want to make us hurry up so that we can get through whatever's making us anxious. But in fact, it's in those moments we most need to slow down so we can choose what we want to do and respond from who we are, not from what the anxious part of us wants us to do to get rid of the anxiety. The more we can slow down and interrupt our lives, the more we can start to take time to really experience ourselves as whole relational people, instead of getting caught up in the hurry from one to the next. There's a wonderful research study about interruption that was done probably 50 years ago at an Ivy League college, somewhere in the Northeast. I can't recall which one. And in this study, they took a group of about 100 seminary students, and they told half of them that they needed to give a presentation on the Good Samaritan, which is the biblical story about a Samaritan who stops to help a man in trouble on the side of a road. They tell the other half they're just going to go and give a talk about future careers for seminarians. And about a week later, they come one at a time to give their talk. And when each one arrives to give their talk, there's a person there that says, "Oh no, we've decided to record the talk. So could you hurry over to the recording studio across the way to record the talk?" They tell half of these students, "You have to hurry to get there. You're already running late, and you need to get there as quickly as you can." They tell the other half of the students, "Take your time in getting there. They're running behind. You have lots of time to get there." Now, there's a direct path between where they are and where the recording studio is. And they've planted an actor halfway between them who's laying on the side of the road suffering, just as in the Good Samaritan story. And as these people go by, these seminary students, they study who stops to help this person suffering. And what they find is there's no difference between who stops, between the people who are going to talk about the Good Samaritan, the people who are going to talk about future careers. But what they find is there's a remarkable difference between the people who had to hurry, and the people who could go slowly. For those who were told to hurry, almost none of them stopped. For those who were told they had time, they stopped, slowed down, almost to a person, helped this person on the side of the road. Now, this is a very telling story, and it in some ways is a lovely metaphor. We are the people suffering on the side of the road, suffering from loneliness and isolation and exhaustion. It's so important that we slow down and interrupt our lives so we can come to care for ourselves and at each moment choose the life we want to have. Now, the more and more we do that inside of ourselves, with ourselves, the more and more we begin to do that with the people around us, outside of us, as we start to slow down and spend time with our inner world to choose the life we want to have. We start to slow down and spend more time to really hear the people around us and to more richly be in relationship with these people. You can switch the slide here, Francesca, if you get a chance. And the more we slow down and spend time with these people, the more we transform the very way we relate to them. We make the time to really hear and understand them. And we make the time to really be heard and understood by them. This changes the way we are in conflict with each other. Conflict no longer is about how quickly can I get this to resolution. It becomes, how can I hear your part of the truth? How can you hear my part of the truth? And how together can we build a meta solution that is better than what either of us could have possibly come up with on our own? As we do this, we already begin to live as if we were living in a village with true time for ourselves and each other. And then from here, a vision can start to emerge for us. What do we want our lives to really look like? And what would it look like to allow our lives to evolve into a greater life in the village? Do we return and buy land and start our own, or move into an existing intentional community or eco-village? Or do we stay where we are and within this community start to build a community that leans more on social support, more on mutuality than it does on our own individual need to fiscally protect ourselves? And this very idea of slowing down, interrupting our lives, making time for ourselves, making time for each other is at the heart of every village. And it is very much our way back home to each other. Okay, I think that that's everything we had to share. And I think we've talked for quite a while, you and I, Francesca. So let's pause here and let me share a couple things. We want to make sure there's time for questions and answers. We also, on the next slide, if you want to go to it, have made some room for an experiential activity that we can engage in together. But before I go on, Francesca goes on, let's make sure we pause and do what I just said we did. Slow down and make some room for relationship and see where you all are and what you may or may not need now. You could maybe kill the slideshow for now, Francesca, and we can just come back to it as needed. All right, let's just pause and make room and just see, where are you guys, having listened to us talk for an hour and 10 minutes, and you're all still here, remarkably enough. Thank you so much. What might we talk? What might your insights be? What does your wisdom have to say about this? What might we answer for you, if anything? Yeah, please.
I want to just, so I've lived in Findhorn in the community for the last 30 odd years. And so I do live in a very rich social context. However, I observe in my own life, and I can almost say we because, because it's quite prominent in our context, there is quite a creative tension between our community engagement and our need to look after ourselves. Burnout is actually quite a common feature, which perhaps contradicts what you and Francesca are talking about. And I mean, I came to your presentation because you said the psychology of intentional communities. I thought, oh, good, I can learn something how to deal with that exhaustion that comes from too much social interactions. And I hear other intentional communities around the world struggling with conflict, with at times quite violent challenges, particularly the old ones. Okay, there are the ones that didn't survive, so we don't know how old they would have gotten had they survived. But the old ones, Oroville, Findhorn, many other places, we are really sort of on the rub right now, economically, but also socially, interaction-wise. And I developed post-viral syndrome after a flu 15 years ago. And I just now attend a lot of meetings on Zoom because I can be present and cognizant of what's going on in the community, but I'm not spending my vital energy in the social interactions that would just have me completely exhausted and I wouldn't be able to do anything for the next 3 days. So how does that experience match? In a way, it's a bit the sort of the journey around the world. How do the people that live the ideal that you're describing, how can we learn from those insights to be more balanced in our social interactions?
Absolutely. Francesca, do you want to speak first to that, since you have some parallel experience, or do you want me to? I wanted to give you that chance. I know you've shared something very similar with me.
It's just funny. I'll just quickly tell you, Cornelia, I've been in 2 intentional communities. They were small, co-op situations. And it's interesting because I was very young. The first one I was 19, and it was a group of people who had lived on a commune who moved back to the city and began a co-op. And I was the only college student in a group of, I believe there were 18 of us. And I personally did not enjoy the experience of, we had weekly meetings where we had to express our feelings and our interpersonal things. And for me, it was burdensome. I wasn't in a place where I found value in this interpersonal sharing. I found it exhausting and burdensome. And part of it was that I was in a different part of my life than everyone else I lived with. And several years later, in college again, I lived in another co-op with, this time, I think 24, 25 of us. And almost everyone else was a student. And it was very different. We had monthly house meetings. Everyone was very much attuned culturally. We were in similar phases of life. And it was a fantastic experience. And I loved engaging. I found my place. And so for me, my big takeaway was like, intentional communities, you have to be aligned. You have to be at the right stage in life. If you are swimming against the cultural tide of a community, I think it's a mismatch. Obviously, communities change. People are at different phases of just life. So yeah, I think it's about finding alignment. It sounds like you found a good alignment with, Zoom as opposed to in-person interaction, but I think alignment and consideration, people have to meet each other where they are. And sometimes I think that has to change over time. You can't adhere to a rigid structure. and expect it to work indefinitely.
Cornelia, I wanted to respond, but yeah, did you want to say something before I do? I see your hands up.
Yeah, yes, I would like to say something here because I have had this experience of burning out. Not that I've burnt out that much, but it's enough already. But one thing I found is that if you have a good solid bunch of friends outside the community, that has for me been a very valuable buffer because often the people in the community are not all your personal friends, but you have to interact with them. And sometimes it's hard to be friendly. Whereas mostly the friends you have outside are kind of chosen friends and you hang out with them and you don't have to deal with the stuff that happened in the main meeting yesterday and so on. So I found that that is a buffer. And I do notice that communities where people don't have friends in their immediate neighborhood outside the community, they're more of that intense, uncomfortable intense. I just wanted to give that little, what I've experienced really.
Thanks, Jan. That's definitely my experience. But then,
Right.
how about, Carl so glowingly talking about the village?
Of course. Yes, because you're quite right. And that's what I wanted to respond to. Cornelia, this is a monumental task, this return back. And yes, I perhaps slightly oversimplified it in some of what I shared from this for the sake of time. But the dilemma is that we are generationally the first generation making this change. And so you are a subculture within a larger culture. And so you in some ways are between two worlds. And I really heard you say that in part of what you were saying. And Jan, I hear you talk about sometimes if you are between two worlds, it's good to have your foot in both worlds. Otherwise, you can get overwhelmed in one. It is a very difficult task, in part because we're coming together with all of our stuff from a marketplace culture, coming together trying to build a intentional community, a village culture, and having to figure out all the norming. And if you look at psychology of starting a group, you start a psychology group and you're going to have people around it. The first phases are first there's a norming, and the norming is followed by a storming. It's a difficult process of coming together and getting to this place where you have found a place of comfort. It requires this blend of how am I going to enter into this community with all these people who have all their stuff, who was not born into this culture. These are not the people that have been with me for generation after generation after generation. We have this norming. So I will say that the challenge at hand is large, and it is a real act of courage to make this shift. And I say all this because I'm trying to say I don't want to dumb this down and give you a simplified answer of just do this and it will all be better. I think that would be disingenuous, and you would look at me as if I have no idea what I'm talking about, because I really wouldn't if I were to do that. I do just want to acknowledge the challenge that you're bringing up. And I think, Anne, you brought up a very, insightful way to one of many ways to begin to attend to it.
We're open to questions and comments, people. You can either write it in the chat or put your hand up. The simple way, great. Okay.
There's a way to do it with a button as well.
Yeah.
Right. Chose to do it.
You just introduce yourself quickly.
So, how would
Can you
things
say
be
who you
easy?
are?
Oh, sorry. Am I unmuted? No. Yes, I am
you're good.
unmuted.
I
Okay.
can hear you.
How would things be different if instead of being human beings, we were ants or bees? Like, do you think it would be easier for us to just form a community or a village, let's say, or a tribe? And is there something else in being a human that is not just a negative thing that makes us not be able to be like ants or bees, but also maybe positive that we would be missing if we were just like ants or bees?
It's a lovely question. I've never heard anybody ask it quite that way before. Yeah, I'll tell you what I hear you talking about, and you help me. Right? I hear you talk about how there is a beautiful dichotomy in human nature, a leaning toward both individuation and community, that we long for both. We long to be uniquely who we are and seen in all of who we are, and at the same time to belong to a group of people with whom we always feel at home. And these things are in some ways in opposition to each other. But when a social structure is well designed, they can really harmonize in a way that they strengthen and reinforce each other. And the dilemma with our current culture is it weighs very heavily on the individuation, very much at the expense of the community, very much at the expense of our emotional and relational well-being. You want to say more? Go ahead.
Yeah, that I'm not even sure that individuation is a correct concept, because as many psychologists have found, including Carl Jung and the guy, I forget his name, who invented internal family systems, we are ourselves a collective of psychological parts. So when we are in conflict internally, we're not well, and so maybe one thing is to have those relationships be harmonized. Integrated is the term that Jung would use, is a good thing. But there's also other, so there's relationships everywhere, not just between us and people in our community, but internal parts of ourselves, but also relations between us and nature, not other beings in nature.
Of course.
Now there are mystics who think that there is something else that we can relate to. They call it God or some other term. I don't know, maybe. Their experience is undeniable, but their interpretation is subject to disagreement. But yeah, I often also wonder about the fact that we are so different as humans. Like ants and bees are all very similar. I mean, they only need, like, the ants need 3 castes or 4 castes within each ant colony, but each human is so unique. So like, if I am living in a community, I'm going to want to connect with other people, but not just in a generic way. Like, I'm really interested in understanding how our universe works, and I love physics. So I'm going to want to connect to some people who do that. And hopefully there will be some in my community, but maybe not. If it's only 200 people, the chances are small that there will be someone else like that. And I may be interested in connecting through dance or some other thing, but maybe not everybody. Some people like it, some people don't. It's just that this feature of humans, so this uniqueness of the individuals, of course they are themselves parts of things, but is something we need to think about more. Like, what are we connecting about even with other people? It's important, right? It's not just connection. It's like, what are you connecting about? Something you're passionate about, or something you want to learn from. I mean, connection in itself is great, yeah, of course, but there's other things that are happening, right, besides just generic connection.
Yes, and I hear that as I hear you saying 2 things. Now I'm just telling you what I'm hearing. I may have missed the mark, but I hear you talking about, in part, look, there is connection for the sake of connection. Everybody longs to be seen and known and loved. You want to be heard in what you're saying and understood in what you've expressed, right? But then there's also this desire to express oneself in the world in a very unique way. And ideally to have people with whom we can share that experience with, who want to express themselves in that way as well. And that too is important. And both these things are very important. I want to dance with you. I also want to just sit down and hold me when I'm crying. And I want both those things. And both are very valuable and very rich part of feeling our sense of place in the world.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left. So if anybody's eager to say something, it's important to say it now, because we do need to stop at the right time.
Will we have people's contacts from this conference? I mean, I want to talk to both of you afterwards. There are many things besides what I brought up that I would love to talk with you about, and other people. So will we have each other's contact information?
Dan, if
Dan,
they
could
enter
you
their
go-
email, yeah, Dan, if they enter their email in the chat, will you be able to share it with us so we could reach out? Would that be possible? Anybody who wants to put their email in the chat?
If you want to put your email in the chat, I think the chat may be visible in the recording, but it might be simpler if people do that for you to just jot it down now before you leave.
But there's not like a ICSA membership email list or something?
There
Just
is an
because
ICSA membership email list, and that's definitely something that we and the planning team could talk about to just send out a general.
that would be great, because there are other people in other sessions I want to connect with as
absolutely.
well.
Another tip just on that one, it is available. All the bios and the abstracts will be available. And in the bios, it usually says who you are. And a lot of people you can Google and you will find out who they are. And some places say who you are affiliated to.
Ah, okay.
If you are affiliated to a university or a business, you can get
Right.
to it that way. But I think we're not legally allowed to send out emails of people without their consent, and that would be a whole big thing to do with a couple of hundred people registered for this one.
I put my email down just so
Yeah, yeah,
you
write it in
guys
the
can get
chat.
in touch with me.
Write it in the chat now.
Yeah.
You can access it.
In case I can't find you on Google.
Very good. Okay. I'm just gonna say this out loud, just so said it. My email is my email is almost my name. It's hello@carlnassar.com. And my website is carlnassar.com. Just so
Well,
if you
I'm
want
sorry,
to
the
find me,
first
I'm
part
easy
of
to
the
find.
email is what?
Hello, Hello.
Hello. Okay.
Hello. Yes.
Yeah.
hello@carlnassar.com. That way you have it. Just in case we lose each other in every other way. You can
Great.
always
Great,
watch the
thank you.
recording and get it again.
Okay. So I think I would like to wind up the session now. I want to thank Carl and Francesca for a great presentation. It occurred to me all the time I was hearing it. It said in my head, it takes a village to raise a child. And I really it resonated all the time. And so I thank you for bringing that back to me. I want to thank everybody who joined us for joining us. I, for the inputs and the questions and the comments. That was very good. Thank you for that. I also want to reiterate that on Friday we have our last day, and I'll be saying a little bit about that right at the end. I think if you hang in there, there'll be a little space, 10, 15 minutes for everybody who was here today, not just in the session, but for the other sessions, to come for a little closing circle there. So thank you very much, and looking forward to hearing more from all of you. And I will now stop the recording.
Thank you, everybody.